The wind howls through the cemetery, carrying with it the bitter scent of loss. Victor Ellis, a grief-stricken billionaire, stands at his son's grave, his heart heavy with sorrow. But then, a soft sniffle breaks the silence. A small, homeless girl, barefoot in the snow, emerges from behind the gravestone. She looks up at him, eyes wide with fear. She says, "I knew your son. He told me if anything ever happened to him, I should find you." What is the shocking secret she's hiding? How did she know Victor's son? And what dark truth is about to unravel, forever changing both their lives? Stay with us to the end, because this story is more than just a tale of loss. It's a story of redemption, betrayal, and a promise that no one expected. Don't miss it. If you are new here, then please subscribe this channel and show thumbs up by liking the video. Now let's move to this wonderful story. Victor Ellis stood alone in the cold wind, the chill of winter cutting through his designer coat like a knife. The snow swirled around him, soft flakes drifting down to rest on the polished marble gravestones. The air smelled damp, mixed with the earthy scent of freshly turned soil. A funeral wreath of white roses lay before him on the grave, the name John Ellis engraved in bold letters, standing out starkly against the gray stone. Victor's hands trembled slightly as he placed the bouquet on the grave. It had been 5 long years since his son John was taken away from him. 5 years since a drunk driver had claimed his son's life, leaving Victor alone in a world that felt colder with every passing day. Once, he had been one of the wealthiest men in the country, known for his sharp business mind and ruthless approach to getting what he wanted. But none of that mattered anymore. The money, the success, it meant nothing without John. He whispered a silent apology to the grave, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry, John. I couldn't save you. For the longest time, Victor had believed that his wealth could fix anything. It had given him power, fame, and access to almost anything he desired. But it hadn't saved John. It hadn't stopped the drunk driver who had swerved off the road that fateful night. And it hadn't filled the emptiness in Victor's heart after, losing the one person he loved more than anything. Victor blinked back tears, his throat tight with grief. He couldn't remember the last time he had truly felt alive. The funeral had come and gone, and so had the years. He had buried himself in work, trying to distract himself from the gnawing emptiness, but it never worked. Every milestone, every success felt hollow without John. As he stood there, the wind howled and the chill seemed to creep deeper into his bones. The sky above was a dull gray, the promise of more snow in the air. Everything about this moment felt wrong, but it was exactly where he was supposed to be. At least that's what he told himself. He owed it to John to visit his grave, to mourn in silence as any father should. Just as he was about to turn and leave, a faint sound broke through the stillness. A sniffle, soft and delicate, reached his ears. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He scanned the area around him, but the cemetery was still and empty, save for the occasional gust of wind and the soft whisper of the snow falling. Victor's eyes narrowed. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The sound had been real, but he couldn't see anyone. He slowly turned back to the gravestone, scanning the area once again. At the edge of the stone, half concealed by a bare bush, he spotted a small figure huddled on the ground. A little girl, no older than 10, sat there, her eyes wide with fear. Her clothes were ragged, barely enough to protect her from the cold. Her legs were bare, her feet encased in cracked slippers that offered no warmth against the freezing ground. Her blonde hair, tangled and unkempt, framed her face, and her pale cheeks were flushed from the biting wind. Victor's heart clenched. The sight of her, so small and fragile, was a stark contrast to the polished, wealthy world he had built for himself. He couldn't understand why she was here in the cold in a graveyard with no one to care for her. The girl flinched when she noticed Victor moving toward her. She quickly pulled her arms around her chest in an effort to protect herself from the cold. Her wide, frightened eyes met his, and for a brief moment he saw the raw fear in her gaze. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible against the wind. I didn't mean to be here when you came. Please don't make me leave. Victor's heart twisted at the sound of her voice. There was something broken, something so deeply sad about her words that it pierced through his grief. He knelt down, trying to be gentle, trying to reassure her that she wasn't in trouble. You're not in trouble, Victor said softly. His voice cracked slightly, betraying his emotions. This place isn't safe in this weather. What's your name? The girl hesitated for a moment, her lips trembling as if she were unsure whether to speak. Then, with a quiet voice, she answered, Sophie. Sophie Grant. Victor's heart skipped a beat. He had expected many things, but not this. Sophie. The name felt strange on his ears, like a name from another world, a name that belonged to someone who had no business being here. Sophie, he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. What are you doing here? Are you lost? Sophie shook her head quickly, the fear still evident in her eyes. No, sir. I come here a lot, she said softly, her voice faltering. I talked to Caleb. Victor froze. Caleb, his son's name. How could she know my son? He had never heard of her, never once seen a trace of her in his son's life. But then again, after Caleb's death, Victor had found journal entries in his son's room, entries that had shocked him, stories of Caleb's kindness, of the ways he had helped others when no one was watching. Victor's mind raced. How did this little girl know his son? Was she another one of his son's many secrets? He couldn't fathom how this was possible, but something in Sophie's eyes, in the rawness of her voice, told him that there was more to this story than he could understand. She looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. He was my friend, Sophie said, her eyes welling with tears. He told me, if anything ever happened to him, I should find you. Victor's breath caught in his throat. His heart pounded in his chest as the weight of her words sank in. His son, the one he had lost, had left behind a message for someone he had never even known. Victor stared at Sophie, a flood of emotions rising within him. Grief, confusion, and a deep sense of responsibility all swirled together. This small, homeless girl, shivering in the cold, was the key to understanding a part of his son's life that he had never known. The questions began to build up in Victor's mind. Who was this child? How did she know Caleb? What secret had his son left behind that could unravel everything Victor had ever believed about his own life? In that moment, Victor knew that his world had just changed forever, and the story of how it would change had only just begun. Victor. Ellis stared at Sophie, the weight of her words hanging in the air. He told me to find you. The phrase echoed in his mind, over and over like a warning bell. Sophie had claimed to be a friend of his son John, someone Victor had never heard of, someone who had existed in a hidden corner of his son's life. How could that be? How could he not know? His son, the boy he thought he knew so well, had kept this secret from him. Sophie was trembling, her body shaking violently from the cold. The wind howled around them, sending a chill that cut straight to the bone, but Sophie seemed too lost in her own thoughts to notice. Victor, still kneeling in the snow, could see the pain in her eyes, the confusion and fear that had taken root deep within her soul. Come with me, Victor said gently, his voice soft but firm. It's too cold for you to be out here. Let's get you somewhere warm. He reached out to her, offering his coat as a shield against the biting cold, and for the first time in years, something in his heart shifted. He had always been a man of power, a man who could fix anything, but right now all he wanted was to help this girl who had shown up, uninvited, with a secret that would change everything. Sophie looked up at him, her eyes wide and filled with doubt. She hesitated, as if unsure of whether to trust him. Her small form, so fragile and lost, made her seem even younger than she was. Victor's heart clenched again. This child, standing before him, was all alone in the world, just like his son had been, but in ways Victor had never imagined. Please, Victor urged, his voice breaking through the silence. You don't have to be afraid. I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to help." With a small nod, Sophie finally stepped forward, her steps hesitant but determined. Victor led her back to his car and they drove in silence, the tension hanging thick between them. Sophie stared out the window, lost in her own world, her fingers twisting in her lap as if she were trying to hold on to something that kept slipping away. When they arrived at his mansion, Victor opened the door for her, ushering her inside. The warmth of the house was a stark contrast to the cold air outside, and Sophie's breath came out in soft puffs as she stepped over the threshold. She looked around the grand entryway, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and fear. She wasn't used to places like this, places of luxury and comfort. Victor could tell. "Are you hungry?" he asked softly, trying to make her feel at ease. "I can have something brought up." Sophie shook her head slowly, her eyes glancing down at her worn clothes. "I'm okay," she murmured, though her stomach growled loudly, betraying her. Victor gave her a soft smile and took her hand. "Come with me," he said, leading her to the guest room. "You need rest, and some food. You've been through enough." Sophie followed him, but her gaze was glued to the walls, the marble floors, the grandeur that seemed so out of place for someone like her. She hadn't lived a life like this. She had lived on the streets, in hiding, surviving each day as best she could. The silence in the room felt oppressive, and for a moment, Victor wondered if he had made a mistake bringing this child into his home. But the pull of her words, the bond she had with his son, kept him grounded. Victor sat her down on the bed, then pulled a blanket from the closet and draped it around her shoulders. She looked at him, her face softening with a quiet vulnerability. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking slightly. "I didn't mean to come here, I didn't know where else to go." Victor shook his head, his hand resting on her shoulder. "You're safe here," he said gently. "No one's going to hurt you. You're not alone anymore." Sophie's eyes brimmed with tears, and for a moment, she seemed too fragile to handle the weight of her own emotions. Her lips trembled as she spoke again. "John." "Caleb," she corrected herself, her voice so quiet that Victor almost missed it. "He told me you'd help me if anything happened." Victor's heart skipped a beat. He had never known that his son John had ever been friends with someone like Sophie. She wasn't like the other kids he'd seen John hang around with. She was different, quiet, withdrawn, but there was a kindness in her, something that made Victor think she'd been through more in her short life than anyone should have to endure. "Tell me about John," Victor urged, his voice softer now. "How did you meet him?" Sophie bit her lip, her fingers trembling as she clutched the blanket around her shoulders. "He used to bring me sandwiches," she said after a long pause. "And sometimes, juice. He said I mattered. He was the only one who ever told me that." Victor's breath caught in his chest. His son had cared for this girl. He had done something that Victor himself hadn't thought to do. See Sophie for who she truly was. In a way, John had been the hero Sophie never had. And now John was gone. But Sophie was still here, carrying the weight of the secrets John had entrusted her with. "He said," Sophie continued, her voice breaking, "he said if something happened to him, I should find you. I didn't know what it meant then, but now I understand. He wanted you to help me." Victor sat down beside her on the bed, the realization crashing into him like a tidal wave. Caleb had known something he hadn't shared with anyone else. And now, in this small broken child, Victor saw the last piece of his son's soul. He reached for Sophie's hand, feeling a sense of responsibility surge through him. "You're not alone anymore, Sophie," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're safe here, I promise." Sophie's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment the weight of everything she had endured seemed too much for her to bear. But in that moment, as Victor held her hand and promised her safety, something changed. She had found the one person who could help her, the one person who would honor the friendship John had shared with her. Victor looked at her with a new sense of purpose. He had spent so long grieving, so long drowning in his own sorrow, but now for the first time in years he felt like he had something to live for again. He would protect Sophie. He would keep his son's promise. And in doing so, he would begin to heal the wounds that had cut so deep, that had torn apart everything he had once known. Victor Ellis had always been a man who trusted facts, who relied on numbers, and who believed that if you worked hard enough, anything could be achieved. Yet in this moment, sitting in the warmth of his grand home, surrounded by the silence of a house that felt so much emptier than it ever had before, he found himself wondering if he had ever truly known his son. The weight of Sophie's words hung heavily in the air as he sat in the study, the walls lined with books that had never brought him comfort. He gazed out of the window at the sprawling estate beyond, the cold winter landscape stretching out before him. His mind kept going back to what Sophie had said. "John told me you'd help me." It felt like a message left behind, a legacy wrapped in secrecy, and it gnawed at Victor's insides. The more he thought about it, the more questions arose. Sophie's story didn't add up with the image he had of John. The boy he had raised was always so wrapped up in his own world, buried in his studies, his extracurricular activities, and his future. Yet here was this girl, this homeless child, who spoke of him with a tenderness and familiarity that Victor could never have imagined. Sophie's stories of John caring for her, giving her food when no one else had, were a stark contrast to the image of the distant, sometimes aloof son he had known. Victor couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to this story. There had to be. He needed answers. That night, after settling Sophie into a guest room with a hot meal and blankets, Victor retreated to his study. The mansion felt strangely hollow in the evening's quiet, the ticking of the clock the only sound. As he sat behind his desk, his fingers hovered over the keyboard, uncertainty gripping him. He wasn't sure where to start, but one thing was clear. Sophie was telling the truth, and he had to find out why. He called his old friend, James Harper, a private investigator he had worked with in the past. Victor had used James's services in the past to uncover corporate secrets to outmaneuver rivals in business, but this was different. This wasn't about business. This was about his son, the son he had lost, and the truth that had been buried with him. Within hours, James was at Victor's mansion. They sat in Victor's study, a stack of papers and files spread across the desk between them. James, a man with years of experience in the investigative world, leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes scanning the files Victor had gathered. "So, what exactly are we looking for?" James asked, his voice steady. His eyes darted from the pictures of John that lined the walls to the papers Victor had laid out before him. Victor's voice was thick with emotion as he spoke. "My son, Caleb. He had a friend, someone named Sophie. She says that John cared for her, that he promised her if something ever happened to him, she should find me. But that doesn't make sense. I never knew about this girl. He never mentioned her. I need to know who she is, and more importantly, I need to understand why John kept her a secret." James nodded, his expression serious. "All right, let's start with what we know. Tell me everything about John's life before, you know." Victor nodded, leaning forward. John was brilliant. He was always focused on his future. Business, school, everything had a plan. He wanted to follow in my footsteps, build an empire of his own. But he had a softer side. There were journal entries I found after his death, stories about helping people, about giving without expecting anything in return. But never once did he mention Sophie. James scribbled down notes as Victor spoke, clearly processing the information. After a moment, he looked up. "This is where things get interesting," he said. "You mentioned a drunk driver, but Sophie's story suggests there was more to it. Why would she speak so highly of your son unless she knew him in a way that wasn't just casual?" Victor frowned. "That's what I need to figure out." James stood, pacing the room as he thought aloud. "We need to look at all the people in your son's life, from his friends to anyone who could have been a part of his story. There may have been more to his death than we're being told. I'll start digging into his contacts, and I'll need to speak to Sophie again. She may have more pieces of this puzzle than she realizes. Victor felt a tight knot in his stomach. He wanted answers. He wanted to believe that there was nothing more sinister at play, but deep down, something was telling him that this wasn't just a tragic accident. There were too many unknowns, too many gaps that needed filling. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, meetings, and research. James worked tirelessly, following every lead he could find. Meanwhile, Victor spent hours poring over John's journals, trying to make sense of the boy he had lost. The more he read, the more he realized how little he had truly understood about his son. Victor's thoughts kept returning to Sophie, the girl who had appeared out of nowhere, claiming to know his son in a way that Victor had never imagined. Sophie wasn't just some random girl. She was connected to John in a way that Victor hadn't understood until now. It wasn't until a week later, after James had tracked down several of John's old friends, that the pieces of the puzzle started to come together. One of John's childhood friends, a boy named Tyler, had been with him the day of the accident. They had argued just hours before John was struck by the car. Tyler had been acting strange in the days leading up to the accident, and according to several sources, he had been upset about something John had discovered at school. Sophie had mentioned it. Tyler's anger, his words in the park. Victor's blood ran cold. There was more to this story than anyone had known. As James continued his investigation, more unsettling details surfaced. Tyler's father, Lucas Hayes, was involved in a shady business deal, one that John had uncovered. John had planned to expose it, but he hadn't lived long enough to do so. Was it possible that Tyler's actions, his anger, were connected to his father's corrupt dealings? Was it possible that John's death wasn't an accident after all? Victor couldn't deny it any longer. The truth was slipping through his fingers, and he needed to find it. He needed to know what had happened to his son. The discovery was just the beginning. As the pieces fell into place, Victor realized that this was about more than just his son's death. This was about a legacy, about justice, and about keeping a promise that was made long before anyone understood its weight. Victor was no longer just grieving for John. He was on a mission to uncover the truth. The days following his discovery were a blur for Victor Ellis. Each morning brought a new wave of emotions: disbelief, anger, and a deep sense of responsibility. The private investigator, James, had uncovered more troubling information than Victor had ever expected. Tyler's argument with John, the shady business dealings involving his father, Lucas Hayes, and the strange behavior surrounding the accident, everything pointed to something far more sinister than just a drunk driver. Victor spent long nights staring at his son's picture, the image of John smiling back at him. The boy who had been everything to him. He hadn't seen the full extent of his son's kindness, nor had he understood the quiet, unspoken sacrifices John had made for others. Sophie's words haunted him. John told me you'd help me. John had trusted him even in the end. He had left behind a promise, a legacy of compassion that Victor hadn't seen until it was too late. And now, Sophie, the girl who had carried that secret, was standing at the crossroads of both their lives. Victor was not going to let her fall through the cracks, not after everything she had endured, not after everything his son had done for her. He had a new purpose now, to honor his son's last wish. Victor's resolve hardened as he sat at his desk, papers scattered before him. It wasn't just about uncovering the truth anymore. It was about protecting Sophie. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that he could no longer be the man he had been. The ruthless businessman who buried his emotions under a veil of power and success had no place in this story. His heart, his compassion, had been dormant for far too long. He looked over at Sophie, who was sitting quietly in the living room, her feet curled up under her. She had been with him for a week now, but it felt like a lifetime. She was still adjusting to the comforts of the mansion, to the warmth, the safety that was so foreign to her. Her past was filled with too much pain for her to fully embrace the new life Victor was offering her. But Victor saw the flicker of hope in her eyes every time she smiled, every time she let her guard down, even just for a moment. Victor had decided that it was time to act. He couldn't keep sitting in the shadows trying to piece together the truth from scraps of information. The past had to be confronted, and Tyler had to be held accountable for what he had done. But that wasn't all. Victor knew he had to do something more for Sophie. She had been through too much, and the time for redemption was now. Victor placed a call to Detective Lara Miller, a sharp and determined investigator who had helped him with business matters in the past. He trusted her judgment, and now, more than ever, he needed her expertise. After a brief conversation, they agreed to meet at the mansion the next morning. By the time Detective Miller arrived, Victor had already made up his mind. He had gathered all the information he could: Tyler's argument with John, the potential corruption in his father's business, and the shaky police investigation that had led him to believe his son's death was more than just an accident. He wasn't going to let this go. "Detective," Victor greeted her, his voice steady but his eyes burning with determination. "I need your help to reopen my son's case." Miller raised an eyebrow, but she said nothing as she sat down at the desk, eyeing the files Victor had prepared. She knew this wasn't just about a simple traffic accident. "I'm listening," she said. Victor nodded. "I've come to the realization that John's death wasn't just a tragedy. There's more to it. I need you to investigate the circumstances surrounding it. I believe there's something we were never told." Miller studied the files, her sharp mind piecing together the puzzle. "I'm going to need to talk to Tyler. I'll also reach out to the original investigating officer. We can't ignore the possibility that there was foul play." Victor's pulse quickened. The idea of confronting Tyler, the boy who had been his son's best friend, made his stomach churn. But it had to be done. For the truth. For justice. The following days were a whirlwind. Detective Miller worked tirelessly, and with her help they were able to unearth more evidence, more inconsistencies in the original investigation. The more they dug, the more Victor began to suspect that John's death had been a tragic accident. But it had been made worse by something much darker. The argument between Tyler and John had been about something far bigger than either of them realized. Victor couldn't wait any longer. He arranged a meeting with Tyler, who was now living in a different part of the city, trying to rebuild his life. Victor wasn't sure what he was expecting, but as soon as Tyler stepped into the room, the tension in the air was palpable. Tyler was different from the angry, confused boy Victor had once known. He looked older, worn down by the weight of guilt and regret. His eyes were bloodshot, his shoulders slumped, and his hands shook as he sat down across from Victor. "Tyler," Victor began, his voice steady but his heart pounding. "You owe me the truth. About John. About what happened the day of the accident." Tyler swallowed hard, his lips quivering. "I never meant for it to happen," he whispered, his voice thick with shame. "I never meant to hurt him, but I was scared. My dad, he was hiding something, and I was afraid of what would happen if Caleb exposed it. I didn't want to lose everything." Victor's breath caught in his chest. Tyler's confession didn't surprise him, but it still shook him to his core. The son of a corrupt businessman, who had been pushed to fear, to anger, and ultimately to making a tragic mistake. Tyler hadn't meant to push John into traffic, but in the heat of the moment, in a desperate attempt to prevent John from exposing his father's wrongdoing, he had made a choice. Victor's heart ached as he listened to Tyler's words. He wanted to be angry, wanted to lash out, but all he felt was an overwhelming sadness for everyone involved. Tyler was a victim of fear, just as John had been a victim of fate. Victor nodded slowly, his hand tightening around the chair. "You're going to do the right thing, Tyler. You need to come clean. You need to make this right." Tyler nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I will. I promise. I don't know if I can ever fix this." Victor didn't have an answer for him, not one that would ease the pain. But one thing was clear. The truth had come out, and Tyler would face the consequences. And Sophie, sweet Sophie, who had carried her own burden of silence for so long, would no longer be alone. That night, as Victor sat on the porch watching the stars begin to twinkle in the cold sky, Sophie joined him. She sat quietly beside him, her small form huddled in a blanket, her blonde hair shining in the soft light. "I think he'd be proud of you," she whispered, her voice soft but filled with hope. Victor smiled, his heart heavy with emotion. "I think he would be too." Sophie smiled weakly, her hand reaching out to take his. For the first time in years, Victor felt like he had done something right. He had kept his promise to John. He had brought Sophie home, safe and loved, and now he was going to make sure that she never had to face the world alone again. Victor looked up at the stars, a quiet peace settling over him. "Thank you, John," he whispered. "You did good, son." And for the first time in a long while, Victor believed it.